All right, hey guys, we're talking about the Civil War today. So it's considered one of the first modern wars because of the level of technology and the amount of it, because it's the first time that we're going to have war after the effects of the Industrial Revolution. So factories can mass produce weapons. This is industrial war. And that's why the number of deaths in the Civil War is going to be so catastrophic. There were less than 2,000 Americans that died in the 1846 to 1848 Mexican American War, less than 2,000. Modern estimates of the casualties in the American Civil War between the North and the South put together are upwards of 750,000. Now, we don't have the most accurate numbers, and for a long time, that number was lower at 620,000. But just to put that in perspective, keep in mind that that's more deaths than World War One, World War Two, the Mexican American War, the American Revolution, the War of 1812, and Vietnam, and I think the Korean War, all put together. Okay, more people died in the Civil War. And one of the reasons that it was so catastrophic for the United States is that it is a civil war. Civil war means that a country is fighting itself, brother against brother. All the people who died were Americans. So, that being said, we're going to spend a little bit of time here looking at the logistics, the advantages and disadvantages that each side had in this war. One of the biggest advantages you need to know about for the North is their population. Obviously, the other big advantage that the North is going to have is their industry. So, in terms of population, the Northern population was about 22 million Americans. And this is without a slave population like the South has. This is 22 million people. Okay. And about 2.2 million will serve in the Union Army. That's the Army of the North that wears the blues. They were called the Yankees, the Union, the North, the United States. That's the northern side. For the South, they have a population of about 9 million white people and about 4 million African American slaves, of which about 300,000 were freedmen, who will not be helping the South. And of the 9 million Southern whites at this time in 1860, about 900,000 will serve in the military. About 80% of the white male population in the South between the ages of 18 and 45, about 80% of them will serve in the military, and many of them will die. The ratio of death in the Civil War was also particularly high because of the industrial aspect of the war. So, like you sign up to join the Marines or the Army or the Navy or the Air Force today or whatever, it's not super likely that you're going to see combat. And even if you do, it's not super likely that you'll die. But in the Civil War, 1 out of every 5 soldiers died. Now, many will die from disease because this is in the 1860s, but that is pretty staggering amount. As far as who these millions of men fighting are going to be, let me move my camera a little bit there. You could see that some of them were quite young, like the Strummer boy, who's probably not even 16 years old. He's probably younger than you guys, sophomores in high school. You could see that there were the beginnings of the Buffalo Soldiers, the black units. They will fight segregated, but they will fight eventually for the Union Army. Southern blacks were obviously not allowed to fight because there was fear of an uprising, an insurrection, but they will be drafted and forced to work for the Confederates. That's the Southern Army during the Civil War. They will be forced to do things like clean the laundry, cook the meals, dig the trenches, and things like that. For the North, most of those who fought were farm boys, shopkeepers, artisans, people who worked in the factories, manufacturing in the cities. Many of them were immigrants or the children of immigrants. Remember, larger immigrant population in the North, because that's where jobs were. For the South, most of the plain soldiers, the privates, the lowly grunts, these were the non-slaveholding small farm boys, but they were largely led by an officer corps that was made up of the slave-owning planter class, which will cause a great deal of resentment. And I'm very glad every year to have that little book assigned to you guys, what they fought for, because I think it gives really great insight into these men that you see pictured here, these Confederates and these Union forces, and what they believed that they were there for, their motivations. Many of these men, you know, did not fight to end slavery or to preserve slavery, depending on what side they were on. That's not what they fought for. Many of these men fought due to pressure from their local town, to not look like a sissy or like a coward. Many of these men fought to impress their loved ones or their, you know, girlfriends or their fiancés. Many of them fought for glory, to make a name for themselves. Some men, they fought because they were so poor, at least the military could offer some food, at least if you were on the northern side. And some men will also fight due to conscription, the draft. So the North will not have its draft until actually after the Emancipation Proclamation, until 1863. And actually only 6% of the Union forces that fight in the Civil War will be draftees. The rest, like I said, it was mostly small town recruitment. Lincoln, right after Fort Sumter, remember, called for 75,000 volunteers. The Union does not have as many conscripted soldiers actually as the South does, which is often seen as pretty surprising. About 20% of the Southern soldiers were conscripted or drafted. And if you don't know, being drafted means you are forced to go and fight at, you know, consequence of penalties. Treason, you could be shot, you could pay a fine, you had to go and serve. Now, for the 20% of the Southern soldiers, the Confederate soldiers, the Grays, as they were called, that are going to have to fight, they are going to be conscripting from ages 18 to 45. The Union, their draft called for ages 20 to 35 at the beginning, and then 20 to 45 by the end of the war. On average, the Civil War soldier was older and far more literate than soldiers in ensuing wars into the 20th century. It seems like every war we fight, our soldiers get younger. I almost said something else. So that's some of the basics. You also need to know, we'll talk more about this later, but the idea of the rich man's war and the poor man's fight, or along those lines. It's the idea that in both the North and the South, there were exemptions, of course, to the draft if you were serving some other vital role. And there were far more exemptions to get out of draft service in the South than there was the North. But there was also a way to pay for a substitute. So literally, if you had the funding, if you had the money, you could pay for somebody to take your place, to go fight and potentially die in this war instead of you. And what that means is that, you know, if you're rich enough, you don't have to fight. If you're poor, you do. It was even worse in the South when you had the 20 slave requirement, that basically if you had 20 or more slaves, you were allowed to stay behind. You were exempted from conscription. And so many of the non-slave holding families that have to send their sons, and many of those sons, they were understandably very upset at this 20 slave rule. Now, there's many reasons for this. It is elitism for sure, but also it's because of necessity. If all of these white men are conscripted, then who's left in the plantations? the African Americans. And what will they do if they're left to their own devices? Well, they'll probably leave. They will probably break free. Or if it's just the women and children of the plantation, that puts the white women and children at risk of being hurt or killed in a slave uprising, a slave insurrection. So it was partly out of necessity and partly out of elitism, but that will cause a lot of resentment in the South and will be a major cause of desertion. Now, as far as technologies go, the North is going to be far, far superior to the South, mostly because they had diversified their economy. They weren't just reliant on agricultural exports as the South was. Most of the nation's railroads, over 20,000 miles of railroads, were in the North. Like 80% of the railroads were in the North, connecting towns and cities from the western frontier all the way to the east. It was by this point that, in fact, by the 1850s, even earlier, that most Western farmers out in Illinois, you know, where Lincoln's from, or Wisconsin, or Indiana, or Ohio, or any of those Western states at this time, they no longer traded along the rivers with steamboats. They no longer needed the Mississippi River, for instance, that would, you know, go down into the South, down through Louisiana. Instead, now it was far cheaper and more efficient to take their goods on the trains. And so trains are going to be very critical. And you have also most of the iron works, the mills where you make iron. You have most of the railroad repairmen and railroad building facilities. The entire infrastructure for the railroads was mostly in the North, as were most of the actual engines and cars for the railroad. Very few were in the South. And one other big point about the railroads and the advantage the North had with this, you know, railroads are key for logistics, for moving around troops in a war. You can quickly move your soldiers from one part of the nation to the other. And the South has a very, very big border here to defend. This is a 1,000-mile front. Okay, the South is a very large area, but again, it's not connected the same way that the North is. There's all these railroads linking the northern states. In the South, the railroads that they had mostly led to the coast to export, you know, the cotton or the big cash crops out to international markets. So those railroads are not going to be very useful. Now, the South will quickly start to try to make up for lost ground, but another problem that they had was that they are fundamentally about states' rights. States' right to what? Well, to own slavery and keep their Southern way of life that revolved around slavery. But being states' rights, that meant that they were naturally inclined to go against a strong central government. It's going to take a lot of hard work to convince the Southern states to rally around, give supplies, support, and troops to their new Confederate governments. You know, why should Virginia have to donate all this stuff? Why should Texas? Getting all these states to agree is not going to be an easy task for the South. And meanwhile, the North already has a strong central government in place under Lincoln, you know, that has been established for, you know, by this point, you know, almost 100 years. So that is another thing to consider. And going along with that, the gauges on the railroads in the North were all uniform. That means that here on the rails, every railroad that was built in the North was built to the same specs, about 4 feet across, okay? Now the railroads in the South, the ones they did have, they were not uniform. Some of the railroads in the South were 3 feet wide, some were 4 feet wide. You can imagine that if you're, because every state built their own railroads, right? And so the railroads going across state to state did not match up. So you're trying to send your Confederate troops from one state to another. You need to move your armies around to go and counter the Union assault. Well, you're going to have to pause the train and you get to the next state when you're moving your soldiers and unload everybody and reload it onto another train. Hopefully you have another train. You can see where this is a giant mess, a very expensive, very ineffective system that the South has. So even though they did have some railroads, it's going to be, like I said, a mess. Another thing that's going to be critically important during the Civil War was the telegraph. And there's a picture of the telegraph operator's little Morse code operating machine. Telegraph wires are again going to be mostly in the north, like 80 to 90% of the telegraph wires were in the north. And Lincoln is going to have a lot more built right at the beginning of the war, thousands and thousands of miles. And in fact, Lincoln is the first president that is actually able to communicate in real time with his troops from far, far away, from his headquarters in Washington, D.C. He had a telegraph room set up at the White House where he conducted the war basically and sent out directions and, communicated with his generals on strategy. The telegraph is going to be very critically important for the Union war efforts and organizing things. And again, the South really does not have that infrastructure in place. The factories, that's critical, right? That's why America's going to win World War I and World War II, is that our industrial output was so much more gigantic than any other nation. They destroy, 3 of our battleships. We got 15 more, and we're building another 100 as we speak. That's industrial output. Again, 80 to 90% of the industrial output and factories were in the north. There were 1.2 million factory workers when the Civil War began in the North, compared to about 100,000 factory workers in the South. And there were about that many, 110,000 factories alone in the North, just to give you an idea of how much larger the industrial output of the North is than the South. That doesn't mean that the South wasn't without its own advantages, though. So again, they don't have the population. Slaves at first could be, conscripted and forced to do things at a very dire level. So at first, it seemed like the slaves might be an advantage for the South. But once Lincoln and the Northern upper echelon, once they make this war about freeing the slaves, then that turns one of the South's big advantages into their biggest disadvantage. So they don't have the population. Slavery is going to be working against them. What does the South have? They don't have any industry. They don't have railroads. They don't really have telegraph. They don't have much of any of that. Well, they do have the home field advantage. Okay. The South does have the home field advantage. I'll go back to the technology in a second. They're fighting in terrain that they know better than the North does, because most of the battles will be in the South. And when the Southerners under Robert E. Lee, when they go north and try to take the fight into Northern Union lands, that's when they meet with catastrophic defeat, like in Gettysburg in Pennsylvania. So they got home field advantage. They're fighting a defensive war. And if we look historically at wars that were set up like this, somewhat similarly, you could look at the American Revolution. Okay, the South is an insurrection, revolutionary force trying to break free and gain its independence, like the American colonies were from the British. The British were a large industrial power, but what were they really trying to hold on to? The American colonists had a better motivation. They were fighting for their freedom. And for Southerners, many of them, that's what they believed that they were doing. They were fighting for their freedom and their rights, like their right to own property such as slaves. So many Southerners felt like their cause was more righteous, and I'm sure Northerners felt like their cause was more righteous. But it is harder to imagine, sending your sons or your husbands, or your boyfriends, or whoever off to war, saying, "Well, go fight and die to preserve the Union, dear. Go fight and die to keep America together." Is that really worth a man's life, your family's life? Versus go out there and fight to defend our home. Go out there and fight to keep these Yankee scum from coming in and destroying everything that we know and love. That's a more powerful motivation, you could argue. So Southerners have that, and they also have a pretty clear advantage when it came to the military hierarchy. Most of the great graduates of West Point are going to be Southerners. So that includes in our list, like the head Confederate General, Robert E. Lee, the Army of Virginia he will command. Robert E. Lee was West Point graduate from the 1820s. He had served in the Mexican-American War. He was the one who put down the little Harper's Ferry incident with John Brown. Robert E. Lee was the top choice. He was number one in his class at West Point, the commandant there. He was number one choice for general of the overall army of both Lincoln and uh, Jefferson Davis, Jeff Davis, the Confederate president. Like both sides wanted him. And Lee, I mean, a lot of these West Point graduates, a lot of these military captains and generals and sergeants and these officers, you know, they were very conflicted. They had taken an oath of allegiance to the United States military. And there will be a few Southern leaders, military leaders, who keep that allegiance and they will fight for the Union. But a lot of them, they stay loyal to their states because that was where they grew up, that was their families. And so when Virginia, after Fort Sumter, seceded and joined the Confederate States, that's when Lee basically wrote his resignation and told Lincoln, I'm sorry, but I cannot turn against my native Virginia. So Robert E. Lee is the head general. You have Longstreet, Stonewall Jackson, Pickett from Pickett's Charge fame, Johnston, Bragg. These Southern leaders definitely had the edge when it came to expertise, strategy, experience over the Union side, which was really struggling for leadership, especially in the first few years of the war, because this war, this American Civil War, it's going to last, guys, from 1861 until 1865, and it only gets more bloody as it goes on. Over 50% of the casualties, we talked about those figures at the beginning, they actually died in the last 2 years of the fighting. So for the Union side, old Winfield Scott, old Fuss and Feathers from the Mexican-American War, the one who had led the American troops on the same path as Hernan Cortez and finally occupied Mexico City in the square there. That Winfield Scott, he is very elderly now because he was already an old man then. He is very elderly. He is very, very overweight. Couldn't even sit a horse. But he is the overall commander that Lincoln is forced to choose when Lee steps out and follows Virginia. But Scott is too elderly, and after Bull Run, Lincoln's going to hand the reins over to George McClellan. We'll talk about more in just a bit, but McClellan was a peacock. What I mean by that is he was a very handsome, and he knew it, very clean, polished, by the books, twirling the mustache sort of guy. He really should have been called Fuss and Feathers. He should have been called Young Fuss and Feathers. But McClellan is going to train the troops and train them, and is not going to do a lot of action. And Lincoln desperately needs a general that would be willing to get into the fray and use the North's mighty industrial, power and its overwhelming population to their advantage, which sadly meant, letting a lot of soldiers die to win the field. McClellan was not willing to do that. Finally, Lincoln will find a general willing to do that in Ulysses Grant. And Ulysses S. Grant will become the Union general after Vicksburg. So that's some of the advantages and disadvantages. There's a lot of questions that historians have asked over time about this, like, was it inevitable? Was it always going to be this way, that the North was going to win? Was it inevitable? Not necessarily. Like I said, in the American Revolution, there's a lot of parallels. The one difference there is that, the British had to cross the Atlantic Ocean every time they needed to resupply or get in touch with the king or something. The Texas Revolution, the Texas rebels, vastly outnumbered. They managed to have a victory there. So you could draw parallels and say that it was possible, if this became a war of attrition and basically the North just lost its resolve, the South could sue for peace. Their cause was, not better, definitely not better, but it was more easy to motivate their troops than Northern troops. And eventually, if Northern troops lost the taste for battle, then the South would win. So it becomes also a war of propaganda. All right. So, and the North, keep in mind, the North is having to go down into the South for most of the fighting, 1,000-mile front. Winfield Scott advises using, I need a map. Here we go. Don't write this down yet, guys. I just want to show you the map here. Winfield Scott, the old general, he advises the Anaconda Plan, which is basically to starve out the South. The North has a navy, which the South did not at first. So with the ships of the United States Navy, they could blockade the Atlantic and Gulf Coast ports and keep the South basically from getting any new supplies of food or weapons or anything else. Then they could send warships down the Ohio River, the Missouri River, the Mississippi River, and block them off that way as well. So you put the stranglehold throughout the entire South. You block them off. Now it would take a year or two for this plan to go into effect. And again, that was moving too slowly for many in the North who wanted immediately to have their bigger and larger army with all their resources crush the South and put an end to this thing. Just like in all wars, both sides thought that this thing would be over very, very quickly. Speaking of the navies, there's a lot of interesting new technological developments during the Civil War you should be aware of. Ironclad ships were first used for the United States in the Civil War. So it's just like it sounds. An ironclad was like the original battleship that had, iron plating along the sides. The Monitor was the ironclad for the Union, and the Merrimac was the ironclad for the Confederacy. A lot of the Confederate ships were bought, they were purchased from Great Britain during the Civil War. And more on that later, but basically the South does try to create a military alliance with Great Britain using their cotton as a bargaining chip. That's called King Cotton diplomacy. And they nearly succeed were it not for Lincoln's political machinations with like the Emancipation Proclamation. We talked about railroads and telegraphs. Observation balloons, these are the hot air balloons, they're mostly used by the North to basically do reconnaissance of the battlefield and of southern positions. So a hot air balloonist would go up there and basically survey the battlefield, and then he'd write down his notes, and then he would, with a telegraph operator up there, they would Morse code out their findings, and they had telegraph wires going from the hot air balloon down to the ground, and so they could immediately basically say what they were seeing, and that was very useful for surveying, troop movements. Primitive hand grenades were used in the Civil War, and the very first ever actual submarine. There was the Turtle, a little prototype sub that was kind of employed during the American Revolution, but you have the first real submarine ever to be used in actual warfare here in the Civil War. It was called the CSS Hunley. CSS, the Confederate States ship. Hunley was like 40 feet long. It was about 8 feet across. It was very tiny. It had a crew of, I think, 8 men, and it sank, but not before first taking out a Union ship. And so it was a prototype. There's not going to be large-scale submarine warfare like we'll see in World War I. But you do have the first submarine used in the Civil War there by the Confederate side as a way to try to take down all the massive amounts of Union ships in the blockades. The biggest technological thing and why the death count is going to be so high, industrial warfare. Okay, what about the weaponry? This is it. Okay, it's the invention of the rifled musket. Now, these rifles, they basically have the barrel spun, okay? Now, previously there had been rifles that existed, but it was too hard to reload them because you had to jam the bullet down into the barrel, and you would require a lot of force, or the little whatever you call that thing. It would just take too long to try to get that, especially in the heat of battle. A French engineer actually comes up with what's called the mini ball. And it's called that because it is a smaller round ball, circular ball that goes into the rifle and it fits a lot better. It also had these grooves, so it spirals as it goes through. And the French designer's last name was Mini, so that was also why it's called the mini ball. But the mini ball is going to change warfare. The rifle and the mini ball, that's where, like, I think 90% of the soldiers who get shot in battle in the Civil War, that's what happened to them, because rifles are far more accurate over much longer distance than the old muskets were. So, for instance, most guns before the Civil War, they had a range of maybe 600, no, 500 yards, but you were really only accurate within like 200 yards. Sometimes you had to be even closer. Okay. A rifle could fire well over 1,000 yards, and you were accurate up to 700, 800 yards. And so the old Napoleonic way of fighting, where you've seen the videos and the pictures and stuff, where you march your troops line after line straight into battle. Okay. That's not going to cut it in the Civil War. That's how they started doing this, and then it just led to like massive slaughter, because you can start picking off those troops way, way far away with these new weapons, and so you can't fight that old school way. Europeans, they had many, many smaller wars between the 1860s and World War I, but they didn't get it the way the Americans did. We saw in the Civil War that you cannot fight the old school way with line troops going one after the other, because it just is like leading the lambs to the slaughter. There was also in the Civil War, and these are mostly going to be manufactured in the North. The North had our superior engineering, manufacturing, outputs, everything, versus the South. But they will have the first repeater rifles used in the Civil War. And that's just like it sounds. You'd have to fire a bullet on these old guns, and then you'd have to reload, and it takes a while to reload. These repeater rifles, there were some by the end of the Civil War that could fire off as many as like 7 bullets in 30 seconds. And that was a big deal. And then, of course, famously, also, you see this little picture here. This is a early prototype of the machine gun that will be used right at near the end of the Civil War. Now, it had a lot of issues, and it was also enormous. So it was very unwieldy, hard to position. But that is called the Gatling gun. And so modern warfare, indeed. Civil War is also the first war that you have actual photographs of the soldiers and the battle scenes. Photography was very new. Okay. And it also is important to know that it took a lot of heavy equipment and chemicals to set up and do pictures at this time, to do photographs. So you don't have any scenes of the Civil War that are like candid pictures that are taken like as the battle is happening, because of all the setup that's required. Most of the photos you see of the Civil War are staged. They had to be, well planned. You can see all of these pictures of all these soldiers. They're all, they're posing for the camera. It took a long time to set it up and everything else. But you do have images. Let me go to the first slide of this section here. You do have images like this one here from the Civil War of the dead bodies and stuff. Now, sometimes they were staged for propaganda purposes, but this is the first time, and this is really powerful, that people could see what warfare actually looked like. For those that were at home and back in their towns and cities where the fighting wasn't happening, they actually could see warfare, and that it's not something heroic. It's something, sad and awful and terrible. And that is the power of photography. All right. So those are just a few of the important new inventions of this industrial war, the Civil War. Like I said, most of the deaths will be, as usual, from disease. For every 3 soldiers that died in combat, 5 more died from disease. 50,000 or more died as prisoners of war. That's a POW. The Union soldiers suffered famously in Confederate POW camps, the most notorious of which was the Andersonville POW camp in Georgia. And it's not that the Southerners, lacked all propriety and honor when it came to warfare. It's that they lacked food and supplies. The South will struggle throughout the entire war to be able to food and clothe its own troops, much less prisoners of war. And so, Union forces that were captured, they will suffer much more than like Confederate forces that will be captured and put in northern POW camps. There's a Union soldier that was starved to death at Andersonville. All right. And then the last thing I want to talk about in our lecture today is the very first big battle. Yeah, I know Fort Sumter was kind of a battle, but remember, until the closing ceremonial surrender or evacuation, as Captain Anderson called it, there were no casualties at Fort Sumter. The Battle of Bull Run, or Manassas, I had a few years ago, some of my students, they like to call it I'm not going to say it, but yeah, that's a lot of these major battles in the Civil War, you notice, and you think it's kind of weird, they have two names, but that's because the North had one name for it, and then the South had another name for it. Usually the Southern name had to do with the geography, the river that it was near, okay? But anyway, so the North, they call this the Battle of Bull Run. And we're going to go with the Northern stuff because, as Lincoln said, the South never really had a right to secede in the first place. So we're going to stick with the United States since this is American history, right? But the Battle of Bull Run, it's going to take place in the summer, right after the war had begun, right after, Fort Sumter and everything else was in April. Lincoln's now the president. The South has had about 3 months to group up. And under the Southern leadership of Beauregard, the South is going to launch a major offensive at the North. Now, the capital of the Confederacy, the South, was originally in Montgomery, Alabama, when they first organized and appointed Jefferson Davis as their Confederate president. But they will move the capital to Virginia, of course, because Virginia is the most important state in the Confederacy with the most people and resources and industry. And so the Virginia capital of Richmond becomes the Confederate capital. And let me see the map real quick. And of course, Washington, D.C. is the Union capital. And so on the map here, Washington, D.C. is right on the Potomac in Maryland. In fact, Lincoln will put Maryland under martial law, suspending the writ of habeas corpus, basically suspending law and order there in Maryland, putting it under military rule to keep Maryland from seceding, because that's where the nation's capital was, where Washington, D.C. was. Richmond, Virginia is like right here in Virginia. So the two capitals, the northern capital and southern capital, were like really close, right next to one another. Okay. Oh, and by the way, keep in mind, there's these border states like Maryland, like Delaware, Kentucky, Missouri. These border states, Kansas will join in January of 1861, the Free States. But these border states, you have many slave owners, you have many non-slave owners. They could have joined, but Lincoln is going to be holding on to them for dear life with military rule to keep them from seceding, because the populations in Missouri and Kentucky were enormous and would have greatly, we're talking about white populations, those populations would have definitely assisted the South. Okay, so back to Bull Run. This is taking place just 20 miles outside of Washington, D.C. It's the first major battle of the Civil War in the South, called the Battle of Manassas. Lincoln's commander here, remember, Old Fuss and Feathers, Winfield Scott, his Anaconda plan was too slow. So Lincoln orders the general of the army there in Washington, D.C. He's like, hey, you've been drilling these troops. We got all these recruits. Everybody's clamoring for a battle. We need to show that we're not afraid here. We need to get out there. There's a Confederate army, just outside of our capital. You need to go. And the general told Lincoln, sir, I have not had adequate time to train my troops. They don't even know how to retreat, sir. Lincoln says, I know you're green, but guess what? The enemy is green too. You're all green, and you have more resources. So go out there and win me a battle. And the general says, aye, aye, Captain, or Commander in Chief. Vera, off of me, baby. Don't scratch me. Oh my God, a cat. She's crazy. Okay. Anyway, I'm going to watch that as soon as this video is over because I'm bleeding now. All right. And so that's the setup. And it looks at first like it's going to go well for the North. Beauregard is struggling. Both commanders were going to kind of do a flanking maneuver, and if they'd actually done it, they would have both turned, and I guess the Confederates would have had a clear shot at Washington D.C. and the Union would have had a clear shot at Richmond. But what happens is the Southern line holds firm and is able to counterattack. And the Southern line that holds firm was under the command of this Virginian, Stonewall Jackson. And Jackson actually gets the nickname Stonewall because of this incident here. Look at Jackson standing like a stone wall over there. Rally around his Virginians. And so with Jackson's troops holding firm, the Confederates take the field and the Union breaks, and they break hard. Now, you should also know that many of the Washington, D.C., townspeople and even a lot of the members of Congress from Washington, D.C., had gone out to the bluffs, the hills overlooking the battle scene, with their wives and with their children, and with picnic baskets to basically enjoy the battle. From a safe distance, they assumed they wouldn't be able to see the bloodshed or anything, but they would be able to enjoy the battle and basically watch those Confederate rebels, get what for and get kicked back out of Union space. And this battle would be real over, and then the war would be real over soon, and everything would be great. So they're there picnicking. Meanwhile, like I said, in the battle, it definitely does not go the way the Union wants, and these Union Northern forces, very ill trained, they didn't have much training done at all. There wasn't much time. They break rank and they start to run, and it's a chaotic retreat. They are literally just running, panicking for their lives, trying to find the nearest road to run their butts back to Washington, D.C., 20 miles, remember? Many of the soldiers from the Union side were so panicked that they ended up, horses got loose and wagons were rushing down the road and getting mixed in also with the picnickers, who are now, about to be butchered by the Confederate Army as it approached and was firing off, cannons and stuff. So these spectators, they were also adding to the chaos and filling up the roads with clutter and carriages and wagons and everything else. Many of the soldiers fleeing for their lives were actually ran over by the wagons and the horses, and that's how a lot of them died. But in the end, there were over 2,000 casualties for the Union, over 1,500 for the Confederacy. But it is a very bold Confederate victory here. And both sides went into this thinking, oh, it was going to be easy peasy. And here they are, the Confederates, with their smaller population, with their states' rights, struggle to form a national government and army and everything else. They just proved that this war is not going to be as quick as either side imagined. This is going to be a lengthy conflict. And immediately, because of Bull Run, Lincoln is going to look for some new leadership. And that's when he turns to George McClellan, who will drill and train those troops for the next 9 months, much to the chagrin of Lincoln, who wished that they would get a move on. All right, so we'll stop there. Thank you guys very much, and we'll pick up more of the Civil War next time.